Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. I am here today with Micah Redding. Micah is, among other things, you have a software development background, but you are the founder and director of the Christian Transhumanist Association. And we will explain what exactly that is and what exactly that does and means in good time. But welcome to the show, Micah. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself? What's sort of your faith background like? How did you get interested in, the sorts of questions that you talk about? And I can't remember how exactly we found each other. I think we probably found each other on Dale Tuggy's Facebook page, the Trinity's Facebook page. I noticed you post there from time to time, and we were probably interacting in the comments section or something like that. But anyway, we tried to get a conversation going earlier. It fell through the cracks, but here we are, and I'm excited to talk to you today. So welcome very much. Welcome very much. Thank you very much for coming, and welcome. And Micah, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sam. And so I grew up as a preacher's kid in the Churches of Christ, which, for those who aren't familiar with it, it's a small, conservative, most people would say fundamentalist faith community. And I kind of grew up all over the country. So bunch of different small churches within the circle. And one of the, I think, great things about the way I was raised is that I was taught to study for myself. And I knew that, this was the thing that people in our tradition had done, right? Is like gone back to the Bible and studied for themselves. And my grandparents had done it. My parents had done it. My Sunday school teacher said this, and I took that really seriously, maybe a lot more seriously than many people anticipated. And, and so I really wanted to understand it for myself and wasn't kind of bound by the context that, what I had been handed. I was just, free, exploring from a very early age.
I think a fair number of biblical Unitarians that I know have Church of Christ backgrounds. Right, it's a very it is literally restorationist, right? In terms of its background, comes from that sort of Stone Campbell movement in the early 1800s. That was very much, back to the Bible. No creed but Christ, no teachings but the Bible. If it ain't in the Bible, we don't teach it. If it is, we definitely do. Right, like that, that sort of thing. But it was also kind of that sounds sort of, I don't know, curmudgeon-y or something like that. But it was very ecumenical. Part of the point of the Churches of Christ and that movement was, hey, there's all these Presbyterians and Lutherans and Calvinists and whatever, and they don't let each other take communion at each other's churches, even though there's so much they agree about. If we just get back to the basics, just get back to the fundamentals, you could say, then, we can find common ground. And I believe they had open communion, which was pretty unusual at the time, so that they could sort of try and bring the different American congregations and denominations together. So it's a pretty interesting and cool church.
Yeah, absolutely. It has that history as a kind of unification movement, an idea that really the church shouldn't be divided. Certainly it shouldn't be divided by what, as they would put it, man-made things, man-made creeds, this kind of stuff, right? And so the formula for unity was let's go back to the Bible and let's rediscover everything. And those two ideas, that kind of unity and also the sort of go back to the Bible and the minimalism that went with that, those things didn't always like fit together well. And so we have some interesting history with this. But yeah, for me, like that really, that was still very kind of alive and vibrant, and it extended farther than just understanding scripture. Ultimately, I felt like I needed to understand science and philosophy and these kinds of things, because we were trying to understand the whole thing, right? Like we were trying to put it all together, and we had to study for ourselves. So yeah, so that's kind of where I came from. Now, some of the stuff I started studying as a young person, by like 12, I was like wondering whether I was going to be an atheist. I was reading a bunch of like Bertrand Russell and Richard Dawkins and this kind of stuff. But I was also studying things like C.S. Lewis and Chesterton and kind of branching out into broader streams of the Christian faith. And as I did so, one of the things that I became really conscious of is that in the broader stream of the Christian tradition, that the body and the material world was incredibly important. And in a way that I think in my context, people had just kind of missed or were downplaying. And this was true for a lot of my evangelical friends too. Like there were just, there was this idea of like this immaterial kind of afterlife that we're headed for, and we want to discount the material world, discount the physical things.
The end goal is escape from here, not in here. Right,
yeah,
and that's
exactly.
by no means unique to the Church of Christ. That's a very common Protestant and Catholic emphasis for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of people, that was like the assumption for most people I knew growing up, and across different parts of the church, parts of Christianity. And then I started like realizing through, like I said, through people like C.S. Lewis and ultimately like N.T. Wright and things like this, that there's actually like this focus on resurrection of the body and the good creation, the material world, this kind of stuff that's actually core to Christianity. And when I realized this, I realized, okay, so if the material world is God's creation and God is not ultimately abandoning it, but kind of re-entering it in a sense, or revivifying it through the resurrection of Christ, and then we're talking about resurrection of the bodies, then the material cosmos really matters. And that means science matters. That means technology matters. That means all of the kinds of things that we're doing in human society matter, and ultimately can't be separated from the Christian kind of narrative, the Christian story. And so while I was having that experience of kind of coming to terms with this bigger theme of the Christian tradition, I started encountering these secular transhumanist communities online. And these were often people who were coming from a Christian background or had some exposure to Christianity, who had experienced Christianity as really escapist, anti-scientist, like all this kind of stuff. And so they had a similar experience where they were like trying to move away from that, and they were trying to hold on to aspects of the Christian tradition, such as transcendence and transformation and so forth, that
immortality also.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
These kinds of, these profound ideas of the Christian tradition, but like letting go of the escapism. And most of them that I was encountering at the time just saw it as like, we're rejecting Christianity and embracing the material world, embracing our bodies, embracing transformation, embracing transcendence. And I realized like, oh, that's what you're doing.
That's a false dichotomy.
Yeah.
Yes.
But where they were going, although they thought of it as secular, I recognized, oh, that's very similar to my trajectory within Christianity, within my understanding of theology. And so that's how I got kind of engaged in this space between theology, religion, spirituality, and this kind of transhumanist, futurist, technological conversation that we're in. Yeah.
Interesting, fascinating. Yeah. So can you explain to the audience a little bit more what transhumanism is? Maybe first start with kind of its more secular form, I guess, and then I'd be curious to hear what you mean by the phrase Christian transhumanism.
Yeah, so most transhumanists are what I would call secular transhumanists. They are basically, it's a philosophy and a movement, and the idea is that we want to use science and technology to transform the human condition, and the So this comes out of some interesting things historically, which we can talk about. But that's the basic philosophy, the basic movement. Let's use science and technology to transform the human condition without really any limits, right? So whatever we think is good, let's just do that, right? So you mentioned immortality, right? Life is good. We can extend life with medicine. Let's keep extending life, until we're immortal or something like this. So transhumanism has within it a number of different competing ethics just within the movement that says, like, how are we transforming humanity? What are we transforming it to? What kind of values? And there are really, they're kind of radical but very different directions, so to speak. So there's egoic transhumanism, or this kind of radical individualism, which is saying, like, particular person is going to raise themselves up above all others and kind of like, pursue immortality and, screw everybody else. And, this kind of thing.
A little bit of Ubermensch sort of, energy.
Yeah, and then there's the kind of radical humanism, which I think is kind of the mainstream of the transhumanist movement. And you get this with organizations like Humanity Plus, and their idea is like to lift up humanity together, basically. And so we want to use technology and science to transform the human condition for the entire world, to make life better for everyone, to extend life, cure disease, like all these kinds of things. And then you get what I could call radical environmentalism, and this is where you actually get people like philosopher David Pearce, who wants to use bioengineering technology to transform the entire biosphere, so that the language they use is lions and lambs laying down together. They want to remove predation.
Where have I heard that before?
Yeah, right. So to remove suffering and predation and death from the entire living ecosystem as a kind of long term but ultimately, like, achievable goal. This is the idea. So you get these radically different, like, ambitions within transhumanism, driven by kind of radically different ethics. But the core idea being, like, we want to use science and technology to transform the world, transform the human condition, change things for whatever, is perceived to be better. So this is where I would come in with, what is Christian transhumanism? It's saying, we want to use science and technology to transform the human condition, following discipleship of Christ, following Christ as our kind of central ethical idea, and like extrapolating from there. And in some ways it's as simple as that. Of course, we can dig into that in a lot of ways, but yeah, that's the basic idea.
So what's the singularity, and how does that sort of idea fit into that? Because when I think of transhumanism, I often strongly associate it with the idea of the singularity. Yeah.
So there's this idea of the technological singularity, and this has been popularized by Ray Kurzweil, who is a very influential inventor over decades and decades. Now works for Google, helping them build AI. But the concept basically is, like, if you look back from the 60s till now, there's this trajectory called Moore's Law, where roughly every 2 years the number of transistors on a chip would double. So the engineers would be able to double the computing power for the amount of money, right, and the amount of resources. And so that trajectory is an exponential curve of increasing computational power. And that, transformed our world from one where computers were the size of buildings to the one where computers are, a phone or a watch, or something smaller. And so, like, our whole world has been transformed by that exponential curve. And so if you keep following that curve and say, well, where does that go? So someone like Ray Kurzweil in the 90s was looking at this curve and saying, okay, what are we going to get? We're going to start getting portable computers. We're going to start getting all these kinds of capabilities on of computation. Where is that going to lead? And so he's like charting it out 2009, 2019, 2029, 2039. And what he sees is like, okay, if this curve continues, then in 2029, we should have a computer that's as powerful as a human brain. And in 2040, we should have a single computer that's as powerful as the entire species of human brains put together. And so the idea being like, once the amount of machine intelligence in the world surpasses the amount of biological human intelligence, in some ways, we've entered into unknown territory. We in some ways are no longer predicting what's going to happen. The actual advancement of technology from that point on is probably driven mostly by machine intelligence, not human intelligence. And so it kind of disappears into this singularity of like almost unlimited possibilities and power on the other side. And so that's the idea. Now, not all transhumanists believe that kind of scenario, to say the least, but it's a popular scenario to talk about in transhumanist circles, in particular because it helps us think about like what kinds of things are actually possible with technology, with science, and so forth. Even if we don't get there by 2029 or 2040 or whenever.
It does sound a little bit like a doomsday preacher predicting dates about the return of Christ. And
it does,
and
yes.
then if they don't come to pass, well, then maybe we just need to rejigger the numbers again and, but that's another thing that's already kind of come up is that there are some strange parallels to anyone who has a theological or Christian religious background to be like, it seems like you're borrowing a lot of terms and a lot of sort of, I don't know, psychic energy from sort of religion, but not using quite the same words. Go ahead.
Well, that's the singularity has been called the rapture of the nerds. Yeah. So it's that kind of comparison has been very explicit, and I would argue, this idea of like a transformed, like heaven on earth sort of scenario where we have immortal bodies and live in unimaginable abundance and this kind of thing. Yeah, it's very religious, right? It's very much borrowing from religious visions and Christian ideas. Particularly, we've already talked about lions and lambs and so forth. And I think there's a reason for that. And so the actual history of it, which is something that we've dug into in my community, is very interestingly entwined with Christianity. And so to me, it's not really an accident. Like there is a kind of you could almost look at it as like an attempt to secularize Christianity. And in fact, Julian Huxley in 1957 is kind of looked at as the kind of originator of secular transhumanism. And he poses this, transhumanism as this name for a philosophy of humanity transcending itself and yet remaining human. And he's very deliberately pulling from the Christian tradition. He's very aware of this. He's very he's essentially saying, we want Christianity, we want something like this without the kind of baggage. And he was friends with Jesuit priest Teilhard de Chardin, who was maybe using that kind of terminology even earlier, and had kind of maybe inspired some of those ideas. And he himself was pulling from, older Christian things we could talk about. So I think most people aren't aware of it on the surface, but it's very much there. There's that kind of connection that's happening.
Right. And so another thing that I think if I, listen to Ray Kurzweil or hear people in that sort of orbit is this idea that not only will computers keep their exponential climb in power, that they will get more and more interconnected with our brains and sort of the way that we think. Right now we interact with our computers mostly through our thumbs and through our eyeballs, but that that you can imagine a greater connection such that the boundary between what's my head and then what's this computer gets increasingly blurry. And then almost this can sometimes connect with ideas of uploading your consciousness or completely microchipping basically your sense of and location of yourself, and no longer being sort of made out of meat and goo, but made out of silicon and wires and electricity.
Yeah. Yeah. So this idea of like becoming increasingly integrated with our technology, that is a core kind of aspect of this. And I would say it's actually just a recognition of what's always been the case. So from, the earliest times, humans were cooking food, and this actually changes our biology to be, adapted to cooked food, rather than raw food. And so in some ways, like the technology of fire is actually integrated into our actual biology.
Part of our digestive system is the oven.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so obviously, like clothing plays a similar role in significance, and then we get writing, where we start externalizing our cognition into things, not just writing, but like calculation, things like this, from very, very early times, right? You get a lot of this in the biblical story. We're going to put these rocks here, and they're going to symbolize this process. They're putting something external to ourselves that is essentially a technology that's going to help actually shape our society and shape ourselves as humans. So we continue this, right? And now, books, and of course now screens and all kinds of prosthetic devices are increasingly part of our the way we interact with the world, and become increasingly invisible. And so phones, are connected to our fingers, but ultimately those things get smaller and smaller, more and more tightly integrated, more and more invisible. And people like Elon Musk and others are working on brain-computer interfaces, where I think people worry about the fact that, it might you might be drilling a hole in your head and putting some wires in there, but actually probably by the time we get to where this is widely accessible, the need to be surgical will probably not even be there. So this stuff can enter into us in a way where we don't even really notice, or don't think about it in those terms. It's already very deeply integrated in us, and it's going to keep becoming more. I think that's just a recognition of kind of the reality of how we use technology, what technology is. But then, that as you follow that with all these things, as you follow the curve, you say, wait, where does this go? This goes into some interesting places I wasn't expecting. So that totally gets into uploads and all this kind of stuff. As you follow that out.
Yeah, and so it's kind of similar, 1 Corinthians 15 talks about, the transformation of our bodies, right? Yeah. And it even says, right now we have soulful bodies, right, basically, and that is psychical bodies. And then when we're raised, we'll have pneumatic bodies, spiritual bodies. And these bodies are compared to the stars and heavenly bodies, so quite literally planets and stars and things like that in terms of its glory. So this idea that there's something about us, right, and there's a dying part that will go away and that it will be replaced by this new, more glorious, eternal thing is right there in 1 Corinthians. And this is sort of like mapping some of those things to a technological transformation of ourselves. Yeah, absolutely. So I see a lot of resonance between Max Tegmark, who's a scientist, physicist, who has written on artificial intelligence. He's developed a framework called Life 3.0. And so what he talks about is Life 1.0 is when you have fixed hardware and fixed software. So like a bacteria, it's born, whatever the term is, it generates, and it has a fixed behavioral pattern and a fixed physical pattern for its entire life.
And then you get into Life 2.0, which is fixed hardware and dynamic software. So this would be us, right? We're born, we have kind of fixed biology, but our psychology our behavior is completely changeable. We can learn new things. We can change, our way of responding. All kinds of stuff about ourselves is dynamic at that mental level, but not so much at the biological level. And so then Life 3.0, by his reckoning, would be where you have both dynamic psychology, dynamic software, and dynamic hardware, dynamic biology. And so where not only could you change your mind about things, you could change your body, right? And you would be in this kind of sort of complete control of your body in a similar way to the way we might be in complete control of your mind. I think there's some real resonances between that idea and the idea that Paul's working with about transformation and what exactly is being transformed and how that plays out. But the idea that in some sense it's about expanding our agency into new ways and new aspects of our being. I think I think there's something there, and with power comes danger, comes risk, comes responsibility, and so that's part of it too, right? Maybe in some ways, from a theological perspective, you could say the reason we don't have some of that power right now is because we aren't able to handle it. This kind of thing. So
yeah. And so how exactly should Christians be thinking about these things? Because I bet a lot of people are just like, run away,
Yeah.
A sort of you could call it a Luddite, impulse, or a Mennonite impulse. Just go away, stop using these things, etc. But yet these same people, probably will FaceTime with their grandma later today.
Sure.
And have ear pods in their ears, which are something like a prosthetic, and, get in their car and travel a couple hundred miles in a way that humans before 100 years ago would never be able to imagine. So, so in some sense, what you're saying is like weird and scary, but in some sense it's also like, well, guys, just look around you at kind of what's already happening, and also what do you imagine things will be like, for the next generation, etc. So how do you think that a Christian should approach these things?
Yeah, so obviously, like you said, things have changed a lot in the last century. Like any kind of time period you put recently, like things have just dramatically changed and been in this process of change for like at least 500 years. And so the people who actually have the ability to shape that change for the better are the people who do look ahead to the kind of scary things, right? That's an aspect of it, where the people who are kind of just following along and like adapt as it happens, are missing an opportunity to actually be generative and contribute to like better outcomes and better futures. And so I think there's a strong resonance with Christian faith here, that there's a strong future orientation to the Christian understanding, the Christian perspective that actually should be at play here. So that's one thing. But I would go really deep with this, or really simple, depending on how you look at it. I would just go to Genesis 1, first page of the Bible. And what we see is God has this creative process that God lays out. And then God says, I'm going to create a being in my likeness. I'm going to create a being to be my image and likeness, and to do the kinds of work that I am doing in the world. And so you see this, that humanity is actually given this nature as creative beings and called to do creative work. And you even see this modeled. So like in Genesis 1, God names and categorizes creation. And then in Genesis 2, God leads humanity in naming and categorizing creation. And this kind of thing plays out, I think, in the biblical story, where it's essentially we are called to do creative work. And that is science and technology in their kind of embryonic forms. And it's been understood as science and technology essentially, I think for the entire Christian tradition, it was understood that what we're looking at in Genesis 1, what we're seeing in Genesis 2, what we see talked about in the next several chapters is the human calling to science and technology as kind of our way of imaging the creator God. And so I would say this idea of like, let's just run away, or like hands off, or even just like, let's coast along and, not think too much about it. Those are insufficiently Christian ideas. Like, as Christians, we should be thinking of ourselves as creative beings made in the image of God, given this ability to engage science and technology, and so given a responsibility for that. Right? This is part of our calling. This is part of our responsibility as humans. We need to be thinking deeply about this, and Christians, above all, should be thinking deeply about this. This is the thing that we're saying. We were made in some sense to do this, to create and cultivate life, to uplift creation, and so this is a responsibility Christians should be embracing, not just running away from.
Yeah, that makes sense. What do you make of some of the kind of early stories in Genesis where it's talking about kind of technology and weaponry and stuff like that, and associating it with the sons of Cain, right? There's sort of this it seems like almost a negative intonation, right? Of technology, associating it with warfare and violence, and connecting it with Cain's lineage, right, which is obviously a negative place to locate some of that.
Yeah, so technology has both, power, and with power comes danger, right? And so what's interesting is in Genesis, I would say the fundamental technology that gets associated with Cain is that of a city. So you get, Cain kills his brother and then goes off and builds a city. So this is the first city, and it's in some sense founded on murder. And you see this actually through history, and particularly in Genesis, is the idea that cities are founded on murder or evil in some way. And so there's a question, I think, that Genesis is raising, which is like, is there a way to build a better city? Is there a way to build a city that's not founded on death and murder and so forth, but actually is founded on peace and life and right? And so that kind of leads you into thinking about Jerusalem, the city of peace. And this is the call of Abraham, ultimately, is to be able to found a society and that actually is different than Cain's kind of society. And but you get those two things, the lineage of Cain, which ends up in a person named Lamech, who says, Cain was avenged 7 times. I'm going to be avenged 77 times. Like, essentially, like, somebody hurts me, I'm going to, multiply that violence by 77 times. And then there's a lineage of Seth that comes out, which is there's a Lamech who lives 777 years. So life is contrasted with violence, and he names his son Noah peace, right? So there's this contrast there. Now, what is Noah called to do? So this is what Genesis 6 says, is like, the world is filled with violence, it's going to be wiped out, and so then God calls Noah to construct a giant ark, right? Which is the largest piece of technology you could imagine in the ancient world. And it's going to be used to save the world, to kind of revive the world. It's this kind of like image of redemption that gets picked up again in the New Testament. But, so then Noah uses his technology to construct this giant, technological project to save the world. God brings the animals to Noah, just like he did with Adam. God seals the ark shut, kind of putting his seal of approval on it. And then when Noah emerges from the ark, God blesses him and reiterates the Genesis 1 thing, right? So it's almost like God's saying, like, this is my beloved son. This is humanity as I envisioned it, is kind of collaborating to uplift life, to renew creation, using its technological creative capacity to participate in the work of God. And so you get that, these kind of points like Noah and Abraham and so forth, where they do use that power, that human power, for God's redemptive purposes. And it's contrasted with the other side, Cain, and then like Babel and so forth, where they use their power to like go against God's purposes. So both of those things are possible, right? We have to choose the kind of ethical path. And it's not that the technology or cities or anything like that is particularly evil in itself. It's that in some ways the evil version might be easier, and we have to consciously choose the good.
Right. Like in Revelation, there are two cities that are sort of the main focus, right? There's Babylon, but there's also the New Jerusalem, right? Yep. So it's not like the vision of humanity that we see in the future of Revelation is some pastoral, agrarian, small scale, detechnologized humanity. We see a New Jerusalem. It's a city. It's got, walls, 12 gates, right, made out of all sorts of shiny, precious things, right, and all of that sort of stuff. But yet, at the same time, there's also Babylon, the whore, the drinker of the blood of the martyrs, and this sort of evil, oppressive, machinery thing. And it's also not too subtly hinted that Rome is sort of, related to this Babylon image, et cetera, et cetera. And so you do get this sort of light side, dark side image of cities, but it's not that cities are in and of themselves bad. It's kind of a common saying, humanity starts in a garden and ends in a city. And so this is, I think, sort of fits in with what you're saying, that there is this positive aspect to human civilization, to city making, to living in large cooperative groups, and presumably all of the technology and stuff that goes along with that to make that possible.
Yeah. This is what I think sometimes people get wrong. It's not from a garden to a garden. It's not like reversing the course of human history. It's actually, from a garden to a city, that's pictured as being larger than the entire ancient world. And, and it's human, it's ecological, it's technological. It has all of this. And it says, even, the glory, and riches of the nations are brought into it. So the things that the nations have created, even if created for evil, now get actually brought into this and redeemed and renewed. And this kind of fits this scriptural image of like beating swords into plowshares, right? So there, we take our destructive technology, we find new positive life-giving uses for it.
Right. You don't beat your swords into scrap. Right, and throw them in the trash heap. Right, a pruning hook or a plowshare is still a tool and a technology that you use for good things.
Yeah, and I would say like the ultimate kind of eschatological vision of the New Testament is very much like it's following a cohesive narrative around those things. And so Romans 8. Paul says, all creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed, in hope that creation itself will be freed to join in the freedom and the glory of the children of God. And so his idea here is that, there's this Adamic calling for humanity to cultivate creation that has somehow been like abandoned or not fulfilled or something. So when the children of God are revealed, when they like actually kind of step into their true like calling, then creation itself is being liberated and freed in. And so it's like the narrative of human calling, human image bearing, human likeness to God, being worked out in this kind of life-giving way in the material world. It goes from beginning to end. Like it's the whole narrative. And it doesn't, it's not that we then throw, like you said, like throw our stuff out and it becomes scrap metal. No, this actually becomes part of the, redeemed, renewed, process of what it ultimately looks like in the kingdom of heaven.
Right. So, earlier, before the microphones were on, you asked me a little bit about my story. So, if you don't mind, I'll hijack the mic for a second.
Yeah.
So, I grew up in a small Bible fellowship, right? I mean, it was a church, although we didn't really call ourselves that. We called ourselves fellowship. We never had a permanent building. We mostly rented a community center. And we had a very, there was this, there was this group called the Way International, which was a Bible teaching organization that grew very exponentially in the 60s and 70s. It was very popular among baby boomers, right? The sort of like the stereotypical Way International person, although this is way oversimplifying, but it's still kind of true, was like a hippie who was sort of searching for the meaning of life and had found, everything that hippiedom had to offer wanting, and then found Jesus and the Bible instead. And so it was this, and there were a lot of, you kind of alluded to that transhumanism sort of has its roots around that same sort of time, that there was all of this utopian sort of stuff going on in America, especially sort of reaching a fever pitch in the mid to late 60s. And that the Way International was something like a Bible teaching organization that had a very heavy evangelism focus. It never called itself a church or a denomination, even though later on it was functionally that, but it never identified itself as that. And it sort of grew into, I'll use the cult word, but I'm going to use it in quotes. It kind of grew into a personality cult, although cult is one of those words that has a very negative connotation, even though it's kind of accurate in this case. But I don't, when people say cult, they imagine that a bunch of people are like sort of, mind hypnotized into just doing a bunch of things. And maybe that was the case for a few people here and there, but that's not exactly it. What I mean is that it got very centralized around the founder and the leader. There was some financial shenanigans. There was perhaps some sexual shenanigans, etc. And then it kind of fell apart when that leader died and there was a succession crisis over who would come next. And so that happened in like the early to mid 80s. And so I grew up in basically what was a Chicago area version of, like, the people who had been in that group in the northern Chicago area then started their own group instead of trying to continue on with the main group, right? And we also tried to make something that was more like a church than the organization really had been. And the Way International at its peak was a lot of people. It was at least tens of thousands. If you define it like in terms of very committed, like maybe 70, 80,000. If you define it as kind of like somewhat loosely committed, it was in the hundreds of thousands, right? So it was a pretty large movement that grew over a relatively short period of time. So I grew up in this church, and we had a very peculiar theology, right? We were non-Trinitarian, right? Which is something that you probably know about me. And we believe, non-Trinitarian just means that you don't, non-Trinitarian can mean a lot of different things, but specifically, God is just God the Father. Jesus is a human being, began to exist in the Virgin Mary, right? And has been exalted to heavenly glory. He isn't a member of the Godhead or anything like that. And the Holy Spirit's just sort of like God's powerful presence at work in the world, and specifically in Christians, right? It's not an independent member of the Godhead. It's like God's power. So, anyway, so that was our thing that we believed in that wasn't the Trinity. And then we also had a couple other unusual teachings that we believed that the dead are dead, is the way that we said it, right? When you die, you don't go to heaven. When you die, your body is in the grave and your consciousness is basically off, and that you're waiting for the resurrection. And that when you die, the next thing you'll know is the resurrection, just like, when you have a dreamless sleep and you wake up to your alarm clock in the morning. And so that was connected to a very embodied sense of what Christians were hoping for. And we talked a lot about the kingdom of God, and that the millennial kingdom and the resurrection is really the central hope for Christians. And, and not some disembodied salvation up in heaven. Right. And also, by the way, your grandma isn't looking proudly down on you at the moment. She's restfully awaiting the resurrection. Right. And then we were also charismatic, speaking in tongues, interpretation of tongues, prophecy, all of those sorts of things. So but it was, some charismatic churches are kind of very emotional and kind of ecstatic and stuff like that. We're sort of buttoned up, straight lined, charismatic. Like, during our church service, we would call on people to speak in tongues and interpret. We would be like, all right, after worship time, all right, Micah, could you give us a speaking in tongues and an interpretation? And then you would stand up, do it, sit back down, right? Very orderly. And that sort of thing. So it was an incredibly unique combination of stuff, and I've never seen that particular combination of things anywhere else. And there are a couple other, probably minor teachings that I could bring up, but that was sort of the gist of it. Right. So I grew up in this church, but I'm not growing up in a bubble, really. I went to public school, and in fact, if anything, because my church was small, it was relatively far away from my house. We had to drive a decent amount, and people came to that church from a relatively large geographic area, like all over northern Chicagoland. And so because of those things, I mainly only saw church people on Sunday. Right. There was no other people from my church in my school or anything like that. It was, it was like faith life was very focused on Sunday and then the rest of the week. It's not like, we would pray for meals and my family was very devout, but it was a relatively, cordoned off or compartmentalized sort of thing. Yeah. I'm going to public school and stuff like that. And so when I go to college, I have, a couple, you could say, minor crises of faith. Particularly, I struggled with evolution questions, right? Because, you can imagine we were very much a creationist church. Although we had kind of a gap theory, old-ish Earth creation, not like the strict Ken Ham, 6,000 years, 6 days sort of creationism. It was a little different than that. But anyway, it was still creationist. And then, of course, the Trinity and how to get along with other Christians, right? And I got kicked out of a Christian, or demoted from leadership from a Christian organization in college over questions related to the Trinity and stuff like that. And I should say, professionally speaking, I studied statistics in undergrad and biostatistics in my master's, and so I've done a lot I'm a data scientist now at a tech company that may or may not be the Ray Kurzweil one, and so I'm very involved with work in machine learning and artificial intelligence and that sort of stuff now. And I would say, theologically speaking, there's some things that I've changed my mind on from what I grew up with, but in a large part, there's a lot about what I grew up being taught that I still respect. I think they were actually strangely right about that Trinity, the non-Trinity thing. And the sort of the emphasis on resurrection and this worldly, hope for eschatology and those sorts of things. So that's sort of the background that I'm bringing to this. And so I'm resonating a lot with what you're saying about how to integrate this sort of childhood hyper-biblicism with sort of a career and a thought life dealing with larger questions that sort of got foisted upon me at university and stuff like that too.
Yeah. There's a lot that you're talking about there that I know it's a very unique thing, but also it's kind of familiar to me. And it's not because I didn't grow up in that, but the Church of Christ are fairly traditional. They have a fairly traditional idea about the body and soul, and this kind of just standard American dualism or whatever. They have a traditional idea about the Trinity. We just don't talk about it very much, or understand it, but because of this hyper-biblicism, it happens once you kind of journey off the path a little bit. You go down some very interesting rabbit trails. And so, part of my young life was very much being exposed to people who had started out where I was and gone down some of those exact same trails themselves. And saw this as even in a church, Churches of Christ are independent; they're congregational, so anything can sort of happen at
a local level.
Yeah, and there was somebody who was related to one of my friends who was preaching that Jesus was not God, and this kind of thing. And eventually, the rest of the congregation asked him not to come back and do that. I think because they didn't know what to I think people didn't know how to like integrate that or make sense of it. But like that was like sort of on the periphery. Like I
believe it was either Stone or Campbell was a non-Trinitarian.
I think Stone.
Yeah.
Campbell was a Trinitarian, but it was difficult because they had basically already adopted this principle of like we're not going to say things that aren't in the Bible.
Where Scripture is silent, we are silent. Yeah,
right. And so Stone is like, well, there's no Trinity in the Bible, so what are you doing? And so it became this this thing. And so, like I said, the kind of mainstream churches of Christ became quietly Trinitarian, like
almost a Trinitarian, right? Not non-Trinitarian or anti-Trinitarian, like a Trinitarian. Like probably it's in the background, and probably most people would affirm that, but maybe some people don't, and it's not a requirement.
Yeah, it's not something that like so. Like we certainly wouldn't have developed like an alternative idea, but people didn't really understand, Jesus is the Son of God, that's that's in some ways about as far as it went for most people. Like there's thinking about this, like I said, I grew up with just the assumption of something like a standard Trinitarian doctrine. But as I began to like rethink things, I read like the Athanasian Creed, and my first response was like, "This is nonsense," and so I was like, "No, I'm not gonna like adhere to this kind of stuff. Like this is not what I think is in the Bible. It's not coherent, like what all this kind of stuff." And I had a pretty negative attitude toward it for a long time, and I kind of was trying to articulate some alternative ideas, and I was very aware of people who were in my circles who were working with alternative ideas. And actually, as I engaged with transhumanism, one of the things that it caused me to do was to kind of re-look at the Christian tradition and dig into some of the stuff that I was very much not exposed to in my context, stuff about the early church fathers and so forth. And that's actually where I became much more Trinitarian than I grew up with, because I kind of got an idea of what, in my mind, what they were trying to do and what it actually meant to them in that context and in the tradition. And my sense is like it wasn't just an attempt to kind of solve a philosophical, metaphysical puzzle or something like this, but it was an attempt to defend the idea and the coherence of theosis, which is something we can talk about. Yeah. And so they were trying to like kind of put some context, some content, some substance to that idea. And you actually get Losky, who's a prominent 20th century kind of Eastern Orthodox historian and commentator, very influential. And he says this. He's like, the entire history of doctrine is about preserving for everyone the fullness of the mystical union, which he means theosis by. So his idea is like all of this theology, all this abstraction, like stuff. It's not just trying to like solve some kind of like puzzle. It's like actually about still being able to affirm what a human being, what kinds of transformation a human being is capable of. So that's how that would be the way in which I would connect to Trinitarianism, is through actually that idea. There's a lot of deeper stuff, but anyway, I just I resonate with a lot with what you're saying.
Yeah. And so, it's funny that you should bring up theosis, because I would say one of the things that we taught in my church growing up was a strong emphasis on human glorification, right? We didn't have the word theosis, and if we had said deification or divinization, that might have made us squirm a little bit to use like the God word in that way. Yeah. But by all functional definitions, that's what we were talking about, right?
Yeah.
A strong emphasis that when we're raised again, we'll have glorified bodies, that this is what, and so I think the difference between like me and like sort of an Eastern Orthodox person would be like, Jesus got theosified so that we can too, whereas the Eastern Orthodox are sort of, and it's not just unique to Eastern Orthodoxy, but like God comes down and sort of divinizes humanity so that we can move up into it, right? But we just have sort of more the bottom up version of that story instead of the top down version of that story. But it kind of yields a pretty similar result in the end. And that, well, I remember talking with my childhood pastor one time after I'd learned about theosis and these sorts of things from other circles. And like, when I explained it to him, he's like, oh that's fine. We agree with that. Right? Yeah. And it sort of, it affirmed my intuition that the first time I heard the word, I'm like, but then, okay. So you're saying that it's a participation in divine qualities, that you become immortal, that you become almost godlike in your glory, and that it's sort of like a moral perfection and, all of these sorts of things. And it's sort of like lifting up humanity into its full potential and that sort of thing. I'm like, well, yeah, we didn't just agree with that. That was actually a relatively strong emphasis that fit in with our sort of, you die, you're dead, and then you're raised to something glorious on the other side.
Yeah, I think it is core to Christianity. It just gets de-emphasized sometimes. So you think about like just what it means to be image and likeness of God, to be a child of God, to for Christ to be the full image and likeness, something like this. Why are we becoming immortal? Why do we have this idea about transformed bodies? Like all of this is like pulling from that central idea that in some ways we've like used so often we just don't even think about it. We say like image and likeness, and then we think that means like we got to be careful about what to do, in the hospital about pulling a ventilator or something like this. Like it's translated into something in some sense, I mean, very important, but very mundane. We think it just means like, you have dignity or
you have human rights or right. Yeah. It could be used to make a pro-life and an anti-euthanasia argument. And something. It's almost like a Thomas Jefferson version of the image of God.
That's right. That's exactly right. And you look again at it, and you're like, oh no, like this really should mean something much bigger than this. Like you can't imagine that that somebody just pulls out like likeness of God and just means something like. Fairly mundane, or that you shouldn't kill people or something. Like there's something more going on there, something bigger. And the New Testament amplifies this dramatically. It's very core. So
even that Romans 8 passage that you were talking about, all of creation is groaning and waiting for the revealing of the sons of God, right? Mm-hmm. That sons of God is the same phrase that's often used for angels. Right. Yeah. I think, it's some people are like, we're all God's children and, that sort of thing, that, the revealing of the children of God or something like that. But they don't realize that it has this really strong, so almost supernatural emphasis on, we get transformed into the sorts of beings that can rule the cosmos on behalf of God in the way that he intended, with all of the power and glory and might that goes along with that responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is actually, I think people just don't see it there. Like Psalm 8, what is man that you're mindful of him, the son of man that you care for him. It goes on and says all this stuff about humanity. It's kind of reiterating the Genesis 1 idea, and it says, you made him a little lower than the angels. You put everything under his feet. And this passage gets picked up in the New Testament. So Hebrews 2 works with this a lot. It like cites this passage, and it says basically we don't see that. Humanity is not yet ruling over all things. And it's using the translation where it says, you made him for a little while lower than the angels. So the idea that in Hebrews 2 is like, for a little while we are less powerful than the angels, But the promise is that we're going to be more powerful than the angels. We're going to rule everything, literally. And Jesus is the one who has gone ahead of us into this. And now we're going to be patterned after him to rule the cosmos.
Exactly. And actually, yes.
And this shows up. I've never seen people point this out. But 1 Corinthians 15 quotes this. Paul says, as in Adam all die, in Christ all shall be, in Christ all shall be made alive. For death came through man, therefore the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man. And he kind of goes on, he says, for he has put everything under his feet. This is a quote from Psalm 8. Mm-hmm. And he's saying the promise is, we are going to rule everything, including death. That's the human promise of Psalm 8, ultimately of Genesis 1. And so that's still waiting to be fulfilled. So therefore, Christ is going to defeat all these things, including death. And that's the promise, right? It's a promise of theosis. It's a promise of godlikeness. It's a promise of reigning over the cosmos as the children of God. And it's very core to how I think Paul and John and the author of Hebrews
and even Jesus in the Gospels, when the Sadducees ask him that trick question about the woman who was married to 7 different brothers, right? And whose brother would she be in the resurrection, or whose wife would she be in the resurrection? Jesus says, you don't know what you're talking about, right? And one of the things he says is that, they shall be like the angels in heaven. Right.
Yeah.
And you could say, oh, well, that just means in terms of not being married, but I don't think that's just what he meant. Right. I think that he meant something even more glorious than just oh, you're not actually married. He means it in the fuller sense. And I think even, I think one of the Gospels says the angels in heaven. I think one of the Gospels says sons of God or something like that, if I'm remembering correctly in that, because they quote it a little bit differently and say Matthew and Luke. I'm forgetting which one's which. Yeah,
I think that's right. Yeah.
So it's interesting. There was so like I said, my church group wasn't in any way descended from the early Unitarians in America in the 17 and 1800s, right? We were sort of our own rediscovery of that theology, but Unitarianism had sort of hopped across the ocean. It was becoming somewhat popular in elite circles in England. And then some people like Joseph Priestley brought it across the ocean, and it became very popular, particularly in Boston in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And there was a guy named William Ellery Channing, who was a very fascinating preacher. There's actually a statue of him if you go to Boston Public Gardens, and he was sort of the Unitarian megastar of his day. And it's funny, most people don't know about this history, but it was actually very influential for the course of American theology. And one of his most famous sermons is Likeness unto God. So you can imagine Boston and New England having been very Calvinist and Puritan in its orientation for a long time. And you talked about, why are some people resistant to the idea of theosis, or why does human divinization sometimes make people squirm? And Calvinism is often not very friendly to this idea, right? Calvinism tends to emphasize a relatively negative view of humanity, right? Especially in the current state, total depravity, complete dependence upon God and stuff like that, right? The only thing you bring to your salvation is the sin that makes it necessary and stuff like that, right? And it's this very God-centric way of emphasizing the Christian story that we humans are created, we messed it up, and then God just needs to come again and save us, right? And it's not often very clear, save us for what, right? I guess we don't have to suffer in hell, right? That's sort of really, it's not save us for anything for us to do, it's save us from misery. And so William Ellery Channing comes into this situation and is just no, God created us. He has a purpose for us. And this famous sermon called Likeness unto God is basically a full-throated theosis doctrine, in Boston in the early 1800s. And you can also hear clearly in the sermon that it's very anti-Calvinist. right?
Yeah.
That when he's talking about some people won't like this or some people may say this, every time he alludes to the they who is against him, it's basically puritanical New England Calvinism. And it's this very much Jesus did it and now we can too. And when I heard that sermon, I was like, man, where was that? It's weird that I was part of this group that had no knowledge. Like, we thought all of those Unitarians were just basically rainbow flag universalists, right? And to the idea that there had been a kind of Unitarianism in New England that we would have had very strong theological resonances with, even though it kind of did go extinct, was something. But it's interesting that this idea does pop up from time to time, but then it kind of, I don't know, it does, sometimes it lacks staying power, and I'm not sure why exactly that is. But this full-throated that God made us to be like him, and so therefore our goal in the present is to try and do what we can to live into that now. And yes, obviously, Jesus is what makes that possible, but we shouldn't be shy about what our future destiny is.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to go in a minute, but there's, I'd love to keep, there's so much here. The thing that comes to mind is that in Eastern Orthodox theology, there is a strong emphasis on the idea of participation. And it kind of escapes some of the maybe pitfalls that Western Christianity has fallen into. So it's not it's not about this dichotomy between do we need God to do it versus can we do it? It's actually that God is doing it through us, right? And I think if you just think about what it means to have the Spirit and so forth, this is a very core Christian idea. But the idea of participation that God is going to lead us into sanctification and transformation and all these kinds of things working through us, so that it is both our actions and God's actions. It's 100% God's actions, and yet it's something that we are acting out, that's coming to us as our agency. I think this is really helpful to get into a different place than sometimes the Western tradition has left us. Now, I think you could also raise some critiques of the Eastern Orthodox tradition and maybe what they've done with this. It hasn't always been as productive in some ways, so you might critique the traditions in different ways, but sometimes being able to compare and contrast across these traditions gives you some idea about maybe the Christian tradition isn't quite as narrow or definitive as maybe we have thought it is, in some sense.
Yeah. So how would you, last question, how would you fuse together the ideas of theosis and transhumanism? How do you link them together? And when you talk about Christian transhumanism, and if you're talking with non-Christian transhumanists, how do you bring this idea in? How do these two pieces fit together? Yeah.
So my kind of discovery of the richness of the doctrine of theosis, actually, I was a Christian transhumanist before I thought much about that, and it's really engaging in thinking about the Bible and thinking about the Christian tradition that theosis has become front and center for me. But of course what happens in secular transhumanist community is people start talking about well, are we becoming gods? Are we are we creating God, or something like this, right? And so that kind of idea is very much present in the secular transhumanist world, is this idea of even thinking about divinities or deities in sort of a new way. I think people like Elon Musk talk about, are we creating AI gods or AI demons, and things like this. And so now that kind of category of deity and divinity is actually back on the table within this secular context. And so then the thing I would say is so if we're talking about those kinds of things, let's talk about becoming what kind of God would you want to become like? Do you want to become like Zeus? Do you want to become like this demonic God? Do you want to become like this? Right? What would it mean to become like God in a Christian sense, to be transformed into the image and likeness of God in this Christian sense? Well, it actually like centers humility. It centers these things that we don't tend to think of in these contexts. And so, yeah, so it looks like Christ, right? It looks like, Christ who kind of, does not hold on to his power, but is actually like willing to kind of freely give and to exercise compassion and cooperation and trust and love towards his enemies, and that this would be the kind of deification that is actually sustainable, that is actually like workable over the long term. Versus what you might imagine in kind of a typical account of Satan or something like that, setting himself up above, trying to set himself up above God, something like that. So it's like theological questions come back in secular transhumanism, and we get to address them with, these Christian categories and talk about why this image of God is the one that we should, be pursuing. It's so for a Christian, like I would say, like, what does it mean for us to be transformed in the image and likeness of God? It is character. It is the outworking of like this physical transformation. It's our joining in the creative, compassionate work of God. And so our science and technology are part of this, because it's part of what it is to actually look like God, to kind of fulfill our spiritual calling and mission. So yeah, these are the ways that I would kind of bring it back together. There is a secular version of theosis that's out there, and we would want to reconnect it with like, what does the Christian version look like? And actually it's one that does center science and technology in some ways, but even more fundamentally centers humility, compassion, cooperation, trust, these relational values that really have to be core, or things don't work, things fall apart, things blow up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or else you're doing demonosis, not theosis.
That's
yes.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
there's a common, people say, are you talking about playing God? And I said, like, it's better to play God than play the devil, right? This is the things, like, let's imitate God in a small way. Let's not imitate, Satan in any way. Like that's the kind of dilemma. So yeah. Anyway, so
yeah. Are there any resources or links if someone wants to follow up with more of your stuff? Where would you point them?
Yeah, so I would just say ChristianTranshumanism.org is where is our website, and you can go from there to our fairly active Facebook community, the Christian Transhumanist Association on Facebook. We also have a presence on other social media. I write some on MicahRedding.com, but yeah, I would just say get connected to our community if you're interested in this stuff, and engage in conversation. We would welcome someone like you, Sam, to engage in this kind of stuff. And it would be very, we're trying to kind of maintain an open conversation, open and generative conversation, because we have people coming kind of from all parts of the spectrum. People who are kind of tiptoeing towards faith from a secular position. People are, and so the way to actually positively impact these conversations and ultimately our world, I think, is to have that open dialogue where we can bring these generative ideas together and actually see where it leads.
Well, that sounds great. Thank you very much for your time, Micah. I'll include those links in the description to the video. My only complaint, this conversation was a little bit too short, so maybe we'll have to talk again sometime.
I would love to. Yeah, there's so much other stuff we could pull out here. So thanks so much for having me, though, and love the conversation.
Sure, my pleasure.